We need to recognize that if there is going to be a move away from global trade and globalization generally, then there ought to be a recognition that regional blocs will take on more and more prominence. And it is against that backdrop, therefore, that the commitment to this thing called CARICOM is absolutely and utterly important for us as a region. It has not escaped me that after the demise of the Federation and as a transition from CARIFTA, it was Michael Manley who in 1973, then having not been a part of CARIFTA in the 1960s when Antigua, Guyana, Barbados and Trinidad signed the Free Trade Agreement, that it was Michael Manley who brought Jamaica into the Caribbean community with respect to the Treaty of Chaguaramas on the 4th of July 1973. In reading the book again, I was reminded of the fact that that date also had more significance because it was the birthday of his father, Norman Washington Manley, for whom the other heads of government felt there ought to have been some privilege accorded to him for his successful relationship with the Montego Bay Conference of 1948, which is seen as really the forerunner of the early days of integration in this our Caribbean community. But what would love look like today? Love for him was coming together to carry on through a market that was bigger than Jamaica in the form of the Caribbean community, which was initially started as a free movement of goods, an area in which the free movement of goods would be started, but which over the decades, and Prime Minister Patterson, I pay tribute to you and Prime Minister Arthur, who along with then President Jagdeo and a few others, Prime Minister Manning, were the principal architects of the modern, not at the time of signing, but the actual execution of the CARICOM single market and economy, and the extraordinary burden of removing over 400 obstacles to the doing of business between our countries and discriminatory treatment in a short period of time. Europe took decades. And yet we give ourselves a very, very hard rap for taking as long as we did, but we were much quicker than most would have expected. But what does love look like today? We've added since then security as a fourth pillar, and we did that coming out of Cricket World Cup when we realized, and Peter, I accord the tribute to you, we worked together then to prepare the region for security cooperation at a level never seen before in the independence movement of our region. And that led to security becoming the fourth pillar of the Caribbean community. Today, however, there is still work to be done. And were Michael Manley alive today, I believe that the recognition that the most important aspect of economic development that we have not addressed in our community relates to the issue of energy. And for whatever reason, it was left out then. Not just in terms of energy as fossil fuel energy, but energy in terms of the tremendous potential that we have as a region with respect to renewables. I believe that the region can no longer pursue this independently, country by country, looking and hoping to capture the attention of a small company here, or a small thing there, or a small thing there. But that there is power in having the audit done, which I've asked the International Financial Corporation to undertake for us, as to what is truly the renewable energy potential of the Caribbean community. And to determine as heads whether not only should we be embracing this within the context of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas now, in a way that it was left out before, but secondly, to be able to allow us to have greater geopolitical negotiating power in seeking to find a single offtake agreement for the renewable energy potential of the entire Caribbean community. This can be done without compromising the integrity of individual investments in each territory, because there are legal modalities such as segregated cell companies that allow a single company with segregated cells which have immunity against the contagion from any other investment in any other cell. But it will require a mindset change that is recognizing that only in solidarity will we command the power and capacity in this new world that is unfolding. We don't know what it will look like. Only in coming together will we give ourselves the best possible chance to fight not only the climate crisis, but the international economic instability that is coming as a result of the many other polycrises. So pooled investment beyond functional cooperation ought to be a methodology employed by us as a community. In the same way that during the pandemic, we learned the hard way that when no one would even look upon us to offer us a ventilator or vaccines or anything, because it was the wild, wild, wild west, quite frankly, when no one would do it, the African Union and the Afro-Exim Bank stood up to the plate. And I remember chairing CARICOM as I was then, working with them to ensure that a country as small as St. Kitts and Nevis could secure access to therapeutics, vaccines, and equipment at the same price as a country as large as Nigeria. And equally, that India would then have responded, as we have celebrated recently with Prime Minister Modi's visit to the region, in being able to see us and feel us and hear us and give us when others who perhaps had deeper relationships failed so to do. I believe, therefore, that the concept of pooling, which is really a relation to functional cooperation, has to be embraced more vigorously by this Caribbean community, and that there are a number of common problems that most of us face. All of our countries, with the exception of Haiti, are underpopulated, declining and aging populations. In Barbados' case, 1 in every 2 people predicted by ECLAT will be over the age of 65 by the year 2050. Unsustainable. In the case of Trinidad and Jamaica, it is expected to be between 37% and 39% for the 2 countries. Unsustainable. And this is one area in which the region ought to be coming together to make collective decisions, because without people, you cannot sustain the level of growth that is necessary for us to adapt and to build resilience in this fight against the climate crisis that is going to take more and more lives and livelihoods away from us. I pray that we will find and summon the courage, but for me, that is the voice in my head that I hear from Michael Manley with respect to how love is interpreted and built out to ensure that we protect as many lives and livelihoods over the course of our future by recognizing that the way we built, the way we dealt with drainage, the way we dealt with roads, the way we dealt with public infrastructure, all of these things will now change because of the manner in which the climate crisis is unfolding upon our nations. Similarly, that we must try to negotiate all of this, as I said, with a very difficult foreign policy environment. And it is easy and perhaps attractive for some, and we will have to find tactical ways of dealing with it. But I have a very simple approach, that if we are going to say that you can't speak to one and you can't speak to another, then let it apply to all countries of the world. But to the last time I checked, everybody who is a mighty power speaks to everybody, even when they are at war. And therefore, the Caribbean region must retain its options always to maintain communication and to find the best opportunities for our development, because no one is giving us anything to help ourselves. And if we don't understand that it is self-reliance to build resilience, then we better wake up and smell the coffee fast, 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 because that is going to be the only way. This book speaks to resilience and self-reliance, and many of you know from hearing him directly that that was a central core philosophy, because in recognizing that you want independence of spirit, that you want to be friends of all and satellites of none, as Barbados defined its foreign policy to be in 1967 in the first address to the UN, that it means that you have to give yourself the capacity to defend that with dignity. It doesn't mean we will agree on everything, but it does mean that we have the right to communicate with whomsoever we please and on the terms that we believe to be appropriate to guide that level of communication. I want to suggest that one of the things, however, that we need to do is to turn inward and to see how best collectively we can work together to develop that regional self-reliance. Domestic resource mobilization is absolutely critical. And unless we can find a way of financing those resilience building activities, they're not going to happen. That is why my country settled earlier this year a National Investment Resilience Plan for the next decade, because unless we have clarity as to what the public and the private sector must both do to build out those bridges of resilience, they will not happen. We have in the region a level of savings and excess liquidity that is there, in many instances earning at an interest rate much less than inflation. In my own country, a ridiculous amount of 0.1%. In the case of Trinidad and Tobago, 0.5%. In the case of the Eastern Caribbean states, 2%. In Guyana, 2%. And in truth and in fact, divisions over who should finance a CARICOM development fund, which will only reach 200 million or 250 million, really ought to be put one side and a singular focus placed on how do we unlock some of the savings of the region to help finance the resilience and the development of the region while giving people a better interest rate on their savings. It may mean deconstructing a few rules and reconstructing and putting some additional guardrails in place. But it cannot be beyond the governors of the central bank and the ministers of finance of this region to ensure that our region's people have a better chance at earning on their savings while giving us the opportunity to finance a portion of our development as we seek to build resilience and develop adaptation plans. The truth is that we will have to do so with haste. But when we do so, and in the case of Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, the OECS, and Guyana, last week we realized that among the groupings in the Southern Caribbean, the excess savings are, and excess liquidity, is about $8 billion US. If we were to achieve just 1 or 2 billion of that, it gives us greater power in being able to mobilize the capital that is necessary globally, some of which has obviously to be grant and highly concessional funding. And that is why, and I come to discuss for us now, what is really the benefit of Michael Manley's legacy from the advocacy for a new international economic order and fairer terms for global economic activity and trade, to our own plans for the reform of the international financial system, which regrettably still carries all of the colors and trademarks of the imperial system that existed before the Bretton Woods institutions were established. When they were established, we simply did not exist as nation states. And that is why the Bridgetown Initiative today has been shaped, and it is by no means me alone, and let me say that for the record. We have taken some of the best in this region and globally and brought them together because it was clear to us that we need policy space and fiscal space. And that the notion of continuing to determine what we can borrow and who we can borrow from and at what interest rates purely on the basis of historic GNI or GDP is as relevant as asking me for my blood pressure 2 years ago to determine if I will have a stroke today. Utterly, utterly useless. The reality is that in the 3 iterations of that plan that we now have, we have seen some success. Barbados was the largest issuer of commercial paper with natural disaster clauses. God forbid, somebody knock wood for me, if we get hit by a serious hurricane. It will allow us to suspend all of our debt payments for 2 years and to pay them and bring them at the back end of the loan. It will release liquidity in the vicinity of about 19 to 20% of GDP in that 2-year period. There is no country or institution globally that will give us that kind of money, particularly when nation states are being forced to finance more and more damage, particularly because of the lack of access to insurance or the high premium that insurance is bringing down on businesses across our region because of the high exposure to catastrophic incidents in our region. That the World Bank today, under its new leadership president, Ajay Banga, has now accepted that it will do so and was responsive enough to make changes to it twice in a 6-month period, tells us that our voices are finally being listened to on key initiatives with respect to the reform of the system. That we have today a Resilience and Sustainability Trust at the International Monetary Fund, and that has the ownership of many recognizing that this is the first long-term instrument that is being made 20 years, 10.5-year moratorium. It is true that the one constraint is that it is for those who have a relationship with the fund. And it is true that there is no quota for loss. But it is the first time that that institution has recognized, or any Bretton Woods institution or major development bank has recognized, that vulnerability ought to be the basis for concessional funding and not simply historic GDP and GNA. But does it stop there? No. We believe, and Bridgetown 3.0 says clearly, as I said earlier, there can be no separation of people and planet, and that we need to change the rules of the game. We need to ensure that our voices can be heard. We need to ensure that there is also the capacity to shock-proof our economies because of the scale of the polycrises that we are facing. And we need to ensure that we dramatically increase financing, not just for climate, but for sustainable development goals. Michael Manley would have been on the front line of this call for economic justice were he alive today. And that is why I make no apology in saying that the Bridgetown Initiative is an offspring of Michael Manley's advocacy and efforts for the construction of a new international economic order in the 1970s. But this document goes further, because it is really asking the world to make a quantum leap in terms of recognizing that in a globally interdependent world, we must recognize that there must be a global commons and there must be the protection of global public goods. And those goods are for us to be able to deal with and to prepare and adapt and to mitigate where possible the climate crisis and the loss of biodiversity. 2, as a subset of that, because we are human beings who cannot survive for long without food and water, that we address the issue urgently of food and nutritional security and water security. Thirdly, that we fight the pandemics, both the traditional ones and the silent slow motion pandemic of AMR to which I referred earlier. Fourthly, that in today's world where there are more and more people week by week emerging as victims of war and fragility, and in our own region, even though we do not have a theater of war, we have, regrettably, the spectacle of being the region that has the highest homicide rate in the world per capita. A totally unacceptable position, largely driven by paying a very heavy price, as I said recently in Barbados, for the Second Amendment rights of the Americans, because of the intrusion of guns and assault weapons that have no place in civilized society. And fifthly, the removal of digital illiteracy and the removal of the inequities that relate to it, starting first and foremost with the absence of access to electricity for over 600 million Africans, and building upon that to ensure that every child has access to some form of literacy that is enhanced by digital literacy, recognizing that access to education is the basis upon which we can secure the transformation and the protection of our societies and this world. And related to that are the two difficult issues that the global commons must recognize and confront. How do you deal with fake news in democratic societies which have the capacity to literally undermine the will of the people, largely because of the power of algorithms and the power of those who have access to be able to shape those algorithms? And how do we find the balance between the power of AI and the danger of AI, which threatens, like Frankenstein, to eat its creator? These are the 5 general precepts for the establishment of a global commons and the global public goods. The problem is that the world is saying, and there's some merit in it, that the developed countries themselves are saying that, especially with the spectacle of war and defense spending and other difficult fiscal adjustments coming out of COVID, that there may not be sufficient public money, as we traditionally know it, to finance these global public goods. Well, fine, if there is not traditional public money available, then let's redesign the system. You cannot tell me that it is okay to say the polluter must pay as a principle, and we simply forget it when it comes to how we treat to the global commons. You cannot tell me that a person who commits a tort is responsible at law at damages in private law. But in the public international sphere, we are not prepared to find modalities to hold people accountable. The reality is that the majority of multinational corporations, as you learned, as Michael Manley learned, even here with the bauxite companies in the 1970s, have balance sheets that will dwarf most of the states of the world that are not the large powers of the world. And therefore, there is a balance in asking those companies who either contribute to the problem or who may benefit egregiously from the solution that there is to leave a few cents on the table.